Recording? Okay. Hey, by the way, has everybody seen, how many people have used those YouTube videos I've currently put up? Anybody look at those things? Okay, they're there. Oh, you saw the cell crawling one. That's why you're smiling, right? Oh, okay. That's later on in class. Okay. All right. Well, we're going to look at another major category of lipids this time. And these are the sterol lipids.
Is this the last part of the test?
Yeah, this and one or two more things on lipids. Okay, and I'll tell you guys when we finish all this material. Okay, sterols. They're another very important class of lipids. But they have nothing to do with glycerol and fatty acids. You don't find a bit of that in there. Instead, what sterols are these series of interlocking carbon rings. They almost look like the Olympic symbol, except they're made of carbon instead of metal. Okay, so all sterols are based on a structure called a sterol ring. So let's make a sterol ring here. So we have a hexagon of carbons, a second hexagon of carbons, a third hexagon of carbons up here, and finally a pentagon of carbons. And that's our sterol ring. Now, for the most part, there's hydrogens coming off of these carbons, but you will sometimes have other chemical groups, including occasionally polar groups and stuff, and that makes the different types of sterols. But all sterols have this sterol ring in them. And sterols are flat, planar kind of molecules. So like a sheet of paper. Speaking of sheet of paper, are you Manly or are you
She's not Manly.
Alexandra? No? Okay, do you have a lab for me? Good. All right. Let me grab that one sec. Here we go. Okay, so all sterols have this sterol ring structure. Now sterols have a number of different biological functions. Some sterols are found in membranes. Other sterols serve as major signaling and regulatory agents. More on that in one second. Until I pick up this lab here. Thank you. All right. So, first of all, let's look at some membrane sterols. Best example of that is something that really has a bad reputation on the street. It's cholesterol. Oh man, my heart hurts already just writing that word up there. Okay, what's cholesterol here for? Okay, we hear of cholesterol for the most part in terms of nasty things like strokes and heart attacks, because indeed too much cholesterol piling up on injured and inflamed areas in your arteries is a very bad thing. They can break off and end up blocking critical blood vessels like your coronary arteries and things like that. Okay, so cholesterol, at least in your blood vessels, is a very bad thing. But if you magically removed all cholesterol from your body, it would kill you almost instantly. Cholesterol's real purpose is not to send you to an early grave, although it can sometimes do that when it's in the wrong place. Its purpose is it goes into cell membranes. In fact, about 10% of the membrane lipids in animals, because cholesterol is made only by animals, not by plants. About 10% of our membrane lipids are cholesterol molecules. Now, what does cholesterol do in membranes? It helps to regulate membrane fluidity. In other words, once again, you got to keep cell membranes in sort of a slushy state so stuff can move around. Proteins and other molecules can move around in these membranes and interact with each other. Cholesterol helps to control that. For the most part, cholesterol generally makes a membrane more fluid. That's not always the case. It depends on what other kinds of lipids are there. But so we'll say controls membrane fluidity. Now, cholesterol in your cell membranes is great. As a matter of fact, it's absolutely essential. It's cholesterol in other parts of the body that you don't want. Okay, now, the fact that only animals synthesize cholesterol leads to a little bit of somewhat deceptive advertising in the local supermarket. You can go into the supermarket and buy any of a number of things. It's got this big sign on it, no cholesterol. Okay, great. It does not mean it's healthy for you, okay? All it means is all the fats come from plant rather than animal sources, because plants don't make cholesterol. Case in point, many years ago, anybody ever hear that stuff called Cool Whip, that fake whipped cream? Okay, well, Cool Whip had like absolutely no, had a huge thing on the label, no cholesterol, unlike that real nasty, real whipped cream, okay? What they did not tell you is that the oils that went into it were things like hydrogenated coconut and palm kernel oil that had more saturated fat than lard in it. The stuff, you might as well have been eating a tub full of foamed lard with some flavoring in it, because that's about how bad the stuff was. It was so bad that the FDA actually started jumping on their case saying, okay, this stuff is worse for you than real heavy whipped cream is. So, you advertise as healthy. It is not. So you either better get rid of that advertising or reformulate and put something less nasty than palm kernel and coconut oil, which is exactly what they did. They switched to corn oil. They still advertise no cholesterol. It's not all that great stuff for you anyway. Okay, so you see something with no cholesterol, it doesn't mean it's good for you. All it means is the fats came from plant rather than animal sources. But it doesn't stop them from trying to advertise things that are not good for you as being good for you. Okay, so now the thing is, if plants don't make cholesterol, what do they do to stabilize and regulate fluidity in their membrane? Well, they make a number of different kinds of sterols themselves, various kinds of plant sterols that do the same thing as cholesterol. It's not that they are cholesterol, but they do essentially the same thing. They have their own sterols, and that helps to regulate fluidity in their membranes. Okay, now a few things about cholesterol. Obviously, cholesterol in the wrong places, specifically your artery walls, are a very, very bad idea. And nowadays, if people have high cholesterol or risk factors for heart attacks, what they commonly do is give you any of a number of a class of drugs called the statins. And there's a whole bunch of them around. They're heavily advertised and stuff. Now, what do these drugs do? It turns out all of these drugs inhibit a particular enzyme involved in the cholesterol synthesis pathway. So your body simply does not make anywhere near as much cholesterol as it ordinarily would. And that, along with diet, can drop a person's cholesterol levels down. They do have some side effects, occasionally some serious side effects, but they're widely used. There are probably millions and millions of prescriptions of that around in the United States. You probably know people that are on that stuff. Hopefully not you, but maybe your parents and things like that, or grandparents or what have you. They're a very widely used class of drugs. Okay, now a couple things. It turns out, although all our cells can synthesize cholesterol, in most vertebrate animals, cholesterol is synthesized by cells in the liver. The liver is a master at chemical production. They produce all kinds of different molecules and stuff. They're very good on synthesizing things. So what happens is the liver cells synthesize the cholesterol, and then they secrete it into the bloodstream. And they secrete it into these huge complexes that have thousands and thousands of cholesterol molecules in them, and surrounded by a cell membrane. And then there's various membrane proteins sticking in these things. So this is what cholesterol is like in your bloodstream. These complexes of thousands of cholesterol molecules inside a cell membrane with some various kinds of membrane proteins. And these things are what we call, there's different kinds, these are what we call the LDL, or low-density lipoprotein, meaning lipids and proteins. Proteins are the membrane ones. And the HDL cholesterol. And one kind, the HDL, seems to have a fairly protective effect on cardiovascular symptoms, and the other, the LDL, is the bad guy. Okay, so generally when they you go to a doctor's office, they'll measure your total cholesterol, and many times they'll measure the LDL-HDL ratio. If you have a lot of HDL, that's a good thing. If you have a lot of LDL, that's a bad thing. Okay, so these things go in the bloodstream. Now they circulate around the bloodstream, and then other cells can grab and bind onto these things and pull them into the cell. And then you can use that cholesterol for whatever you want, like sticking in your own membranes. So cells in the body, even though they have the capability of making cholesterol, all they have to do is sit around and fish it out of the bloodstream and put their energy resources into doing something else. The liver's doing the heavy lifting for them. That's great, but occasionally that uptake mechanism, which we'll discuss towards the end of the class, is something called receptor-mediated endocytosis. To jump ahead again, but that specific mechanism that allows you to take up specifically these cholesterol complexes from the bloodstream and other things as well. When that was first mapped out, the person who mapped that pathway out got a Nobel Prize for that work. And what he was interested in was he found that there were inherited things in certain families where they had exceptionally high cholesterol levels. Like, you know, if you have cholesterol levels about 150 or something, that's not too good. If you're 200, they're definitely looking not too happy. 300, they're probably going to really send you to a hospital or something. Some of these people have cholesterol levels of 500, 700, even 1,000. And people who had that, and it was an inherited single gene disease, people who had that untreated generally died in their teens or before of heart attacks. So, this person named Grobstein was very interested in finding out what was wrong with that. And he identified a certain protein involved that seemed to be connected to this. That was a mutation in the gene. And they figured out, what does this protein do? It's involved in grabbing these cholesterol complexes, taking them in. Okay, so what happens in people with these diseases? And there's some versions of them. The worst case of the disease, you lack that protein entirely, so the cells cannot fish the cholesterol out of the bloodstream. They can make their own, that's fine, they have the ability to do that. So they're all right, but the problem is this cholesterol still circulates around your bloodstream until it grabs onto a nearby convenient artery wall and builds up a clot. Bad idea. So, some people, and it's quite possible that some people happen to have the reverse. Once in a while, you hear or know somebody who breaks every rule in the book. You know, they have bacon and eggs in the morning and steak at night, and they weigh twice what they should and all this kind of stuff, and they end up living to 95 and never have any problems at all. That's generally not common, but it does happen. It's perhaps those people have an especially good scavenging mechanism, where the cells fish the stuff out of the bloodstream as fast as they're putting it into their bloodstream. So that might happen too. The reverse might happen too, and those people would be protected against cardiovascular disease. People who have poor uptake mechanisms, they're at high risk, and now they treat them fairly aggressively. Okay, so that's what we see about cholesterol. Now the plant sterols are no problem. The plant sterols you take in from eating various kinds of plant material, that's no problem in terms of cardiovascular health. But cholesterol most definitely can be. Okay, so that's cholesterol and the similar plant sterols that do essentially the same kind of thing. But there's a whole nother class of sterol lipids. And these have different effects. These sterols are produced by certain cell types, secreted into the bloodstream, and they have wide-ranging effects throughout the entire body. And these sterols are called the steroid hormones. Steroid hormones, there's many different kinds. You have, for instance, estrogen, or some called female sex hormone, testosterone, cortisone is another example. These are three of the most commonly known ones. There are many other types of steroid hormones, but these are some of the most common. Steroid hormones, when they're produced generally by limited cell types, secreted in the bloodstream attached to a carrier protein, because of course these steroids are very hydrophobic, they don't want to be in water, so we dock them to a carrier protein that's polar on the surface, so it can travel around the bloodstream reasonably well, and then gets picked up and taken in by other kinds of cells. Some cells respond to it, others don't. But a given steroid can have multiple effects on different cell types. They have wide-ranging effects, which is one reason why steroids are used sparingly in the doctor's office. For instance, cortisone is widely used as an anti-inflammatory drug. The problem is it has all kinds of nasty side effects, so if you have to take high-dose steroids, you generally monitor you very carefully because you can get all kinds of nasty side effects with them. Okay, now, how and why do these things work? Well, steroids work by binding to certain proteins that we call steroid receptors. And there are different kinds for each steroid. And only certain cells have the appropriate steroid receptors, so that's why some cells respond and some cells don't. Now, once that happens, that steroid receptor bound to the steroid hormone, this complex goes into the nucleus and then it regulates a whole batteries of genes. In other words, for those of you who took genetics, the steroid receptor, but only when it's bound to the appropriate steroid hormone, acts as a broad-based transcription factor, a protein that regulates transcription. In other words, the activation of a gene and the use of it to make RNA. So we'll call it, say, transcription factor. How many people remember that term from genetics? A few of us, okay. Now, depending what other kinds of proteins are in the nucleus of the cell, that determines exactly what genes are turned on, turned off, or what have you. So different cell types can respond to the same steroid hormone in different ways. Now, I'll give an example out here, and this is for the vast majority of the double X set in this class here. Okay, for you ladies, once a month you get a sharp, sudden spike in the levels of estrogen, one of the steroid hormones. By the way, guys have estrogen and you ladies have some testosterone, just different ratios. Okay, now during that month, what's going to happen? That estrogen spike leads to some of the precursors or oocytes, the precursor egg cells, to complete their maturation process, and some of them are released into the fallopian tubes, what we call ovulation. So now I've got a couple eggs floating down the fallopian tubes. So estrogen has done that, has stimulated maturation and ovulation in one cell type. Now, meanwhile, the cells in your uterine lining are stimulated by the same estrogen to proliferate. So they make a thick uterine lining, blood vessels infiltrate in it, and now you've got this thick lining here waiting that will support implantation of an embryo, if it should one actually happen. Meanwhile, that same estrogen is going up into your central nervous system, and it's starting to make certain cells and certain neural pathways a lot more sensitive than they used to be. So now all of a sudden the guy you're sitting next to, who you wouldn't want to give the time of day to ordinarily, starts looking pretty darn attractive. Okay, I see a bunch of guys smiling in here. All right, well, now of course, in many mammals, and that's especially true even in most primates, the females are only sexually receptive at the time of that estrogen spike. That's what we call heat. If anybody's ever had an unspayed cat or dog, female cat or dog going into heat, you know all too well what that's like, right? Okay, now humans are unusual in primates because even though there is an up and down cycle that correlates fairly well with the estrogen cycle in women, women are not, you know, it's now or never, or now or wait for a month. They have that throughout the entire thing. They are more, and some clinical studies have shown that, they are, plus I see at home sometimes, they are a little bit more ready around the estrogen spike there. Okay, so that, we're talking about one hormone having radically different effects on 3 different cell types. And if you use testosterone, testosterone has similar effects. It can increase lean muscle mass. It can cause behavioral changes. People that are high in testosterone, have large amounts of testosterone, do tend to be on the aggressive side compared to without that, and what have you. And of course, testosterone and analogs of testosterone are widely used or abused in sports. How many times have professional sportsmen or Olympic champions had their medals stripped away because they got caught spiking themselves with testosterone or testosterone analogs? A lot of these things are not real testosterone. They're synthesized from plant precursors and things like that. And the folks that make these things are always trying to stay one step ahead of the blood test that they give a lot of athletes. So there's been all kinds of scandals in baseball and football, and people have had Olympic gold stripped away from them and stuff like that. I guess most recently Lance Armstrong got himself in real trouble on that. Well, the interesting thing is he had testicular cancer, which is a very rare kind of cancer, and almost killed him. It's quite possible that that was connected to his heavy use of steroids. Even though he said he didn't do it, he did. Okay. The problem is, people who use steroids for sports often have circulating levels of these things 1,000-fold or more greater than normal natural levels. Now, considering that steroids work by regulating genes in wide ranges of cells, it doesn't exactly take a rocket scientist to figure that if you're going to have something that regulates genes all over the place, that taking 1,000-fold overdoses is not really such a good idea, especially with long-term effects. And that's one reason why these things, aside from the fact that it's chemical cheating, but that's also one reason why these things are banned in sports, is because of potential hazardous side effects that can crop up much later. They're connected with things like fertility changes, loss of fertility, certain kinds of cancers, especially in the reproductive organs and things like that. So we see that there's still common use, even down to the high school level apparently now. But there's a lot of steroids around. These are just a few examples, and they all work by the same basic mechanism. Okay, I'm just going to mention one other class of lipids that has a different structure than either the glycerol fatty acid lipids or the sterols. And we put this one down because you have probably deliberately inhibited the synthesis of this lipid numerous times. These are the prostaglandins. Prostaglandins are lipids that are involved in things like inflammation, fever, and to some extent the pain response, the sensation of pain. Okay, now about 1,500 or 2,000 years ago, the Romans realized that if you chewed the bark of a particular species of willow, it could lower a fever, it could reduce pain, like if you had a headache or muscle aches or cramps or something like that. It could reduce inflammation and stuff like that. So they would chew this willow bark when they had any of a number of different ailments. And then in the late 1800s, a German chemical company called the Bayer Company found, isolated the active ingredient in willow bark, and then synthesized it, making Bayer aspirin. And that was the start, and now there are a whole bunch of other, what they call non-steroid anti-inflammatory drugs. There's a whole bunch of others. Ibuprofen is another one. Naproxen is another one. There's a bunch of high-power versions that are prescription only. Okay, well anyway, all of these things work by inhibiting one or more enzymes involved in the synthesis of prostaglandins. So if you take aspirin or what have you, your body is going to synthesize fewer of these. That reduces fever, reduces inflammation, your headache doesn't hurt quite as bad, and so on. So once again, we're seeing two common classes of drugs. Now notice this, especially for those folks that are thinking of going into a medical-related career after here. Notice this. We looked at two different classes of drugs. All of them, both of them work by inhibiting specific proteins. And that's a common thing. A lot of the drugs that we deal with work by targeting and doing something, generally inhibiting specific types of proteins. Okay, so keep that point in mind, those of you who have medical interest. So the prostaglandins are one of many other classes of lipids. All right, that kind of covers our discussion of lipids at this point.